Okay, good morning, everyone. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Caleb Brown. I'm one of the curators here, curator of Dinosaur Systematics and Evolution at the Royal Trail Museum. On behalf of the Royal Trail Museum Cooperating Society and the Royal Trail Museum of Paleontology, I'd like to welcome you to the special Leap Day installment of the speaker series. The Royal Trail Museum Cooperating Society is a non-profit charitable organization that supports research, educational programming, exhibits, and the local community initiatives through management of the museum gift shop and administration of donations and memberships. The Cooperating Society plays a key role in helping the museum achieve its mandate, including supporting the speaker series. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's speaker for the fourth talk of the 2024 series, Dr. Jordan Mallon. Jordan grew up in Ottawa, Ontario, and was captivated by the natural history and paleontology exhibits at the Canadian Museum of Nature as a kid. He obtained his Bachelor's of Science degree from Carleton University and was one of the first graduates of their paleontology program. Following his bachelor's, Jordan came out to Alberta to complete a PhD at the University of Calgary, which is where I first met him when I was doing my master's at the same institution. Jordan's PhD concentrated on the palaeoecology of large dinosaur herbivores from the Dinosaur Park Formation. Following his PhD, Jordan did a postdoc at the Canadian Museum of Nature and later joined the research team permanently as a research scientist. His research broadly focuses on dinosaur paleoecology and ceratopsian evolution. He regularly conducts fieldwork in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and most recently wrapped up a multi-year excavation of the Hilda Centrosaurus bone bed, which yielded mostly associated skeletal material. Jordan's talk today highlights some of his fieldwork research and is titled Eco Tales of Dinosaurs, 75 million years ago in Alberta. The Upper Cretaceous rocks of Dinosaur Provincial Park and the surrounding area are among some of the most fossiliferous dinosaur-bearing deposits in the world. As such, they provide a wonderful opportunity to understand the structure and workings of dinosaur ecosystems around 75 million years ago. This talk will draw together Jordan's ongoing investigations of dinosaur paleoecology from this time and place and highlight contributions from his collaborators, students, and some of his own fieldwork in the along the South Saskatchewan River near Hilda, Alberta. So without further delay, I will welcome Jordan Mallon to the podium, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Caleb. Whoop, thanks. Okay. So thanks for introducing me, Caleb. I'm Jordan Mallon. I'm with the Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa. So I'm going to speak a little bit about my research, largely stemming, originating at least, from my PhD work at the University of Calgary, as Caleb mentioned. And this is work that's sort of near and dear to my heart. I work on various aspects of dinosaur evolution and biology. I dabble in turtles and marine reptiles too, but this is the work I think that interests me most. So as Caleb mentioned, I do a lot of field work in Alberta. I work in rock deposits that are outside of Dinosaur Provincial Park, but that are equivalent to the rocks that we find within the park. And I think I've got a little map here. The red star denotes Dinosaur Park. I work near Hilda, which is the yellow star. We find the same animals and the same rocks out there, and so much of my research complements the research that goes on within Dinosaur Park. And we find, as I say, a lot of the same stuff out there, horned dinosaurs and occasional footprints. It's a gorgeous landscape to work, and sometimes I'm able to make use of cheap child labor. Not really, they want to be there. As far as the animals that we find in these rocks, we've got sort of a smorgasbord of late Cretaceous dinosaurs, things like these big mega herbivores, and by that I mean animals weighing in excess of a metric ton, things like these horned dinosaurs here, these duck-billed dinosaurs and ankylosaurs, and of course sharing the landscape with those animals, we get these big tyrannosaurs here, and smaller animals like these pachycephalosaurs. And the diversity is just so huge I couldn't fit it all on one slide. Very often when we find a new dinosaur, we want to describe it. If it's a new species, we want to give it a name, and we want to understand where it fits within the tree of life, and so we describe its anatomy. This is a new ankylosaur that I helped name, one of the newest dinosaurs, I think, out there as of, a week ago? Datai, it's called, from China. But we study its anatomy, and then we code it in these big spreadsheets. We run what's called the cladistic analysis, and we figure how these animals are sort of related to one another in the big web of life, and I find this work extremely boring. Especially this part right here, running the code, and yeah, it's sort of a necessary evil. It's an important first step to doing all the work that I like doing later on, but yeah, not my favorite thing, not the thing that keeps me going anyways. I like to think about dinosaurs, as they once were on the landscape. So this was one of my favorite scenes from Jurassic Park. It's probably all of 5 seconds. I think this is the whole thing here, but this is how I like to think about them. Jack Horner is a famous paleontologist. He was asked once about, on a few occasions, I think, asked about his thoughts on dinosaur extinction, and he says, "I don't like to think about dinosaurs dying. I like to think about them as they were when they were alive." I'm paraphrasing, but I share a very similar sentiment. So, I look at a scene like this and I say, could these different species really live together? They didn't, of course. They were separated by millions of years, but could they have, in theory? Did Parasaurolophus here really live in herds on the landscape? How abundant might they have been on the landscape? These are the questions that I find interesting. So some of these questions are we tried to get at with my colleague Jim Farlow here. Francois Terrien of the Tyrrell Museum was on this paper too. And we decided in this study published last year to try and get some idea of the diversity of, or rather not the diversity, but the density of these big mega herbivorous dinosaurs on the landscape in Dinosaur Park. So we started with this relatively simple looking equation, which is D equals K over DME, D being the density of animals on the landscape, number of animals per square kilometer. K is carrying capacity, which is just an ecological term, meaning how much animal biomass can a given area sustain. And DME refers to the daily metabolizable energy. That's a fun tongue twister to say, which refers to how much energy an animal needs for its metabolic demands on a daily basis. So to calculate some values to play with, so we could get some rough idea of bracketing some estimates of density on the ground, we assumed a range of values for carrying capacity. We don't know these values from the fossil record, so we assumed some modern ones that seemed reasonable. And DME we calculated using this other equation here, which is basically the metabolic energy requirement for an animal of a given body mass, which we use from modern ecological work. We understand the relationships there pretty well. That varies between endotherms and ectotherms, so sometimes we assumed an endothermic model or a warm-blooded model. Sometimes we assumed an ectothermic model, which is to say for a cold-blooded model. And as I say, in this way, we're able to develop or bracket some rough estimates of animal density in the end. So again, we assumed some of these values, and others, like body mass values, we're actually able to derive from fossil data. So enough about that. This is what happens when we run the model. So we've got K here, which again is carrying capacity, DME, daily metabolizable energy. And DME is increasing in this direction along this axis. So going from cold-blooded animals to warm-blooded animals, which have high metabolisms and they require a lot of energy to fuel themselves. And then on this axis here, for K, this is carrying capacity from a relatively low carrying capacity environment like a modern grassland, increases to tropical rainforest, which is to say we can sustain a lot of biomass. There's many animals that you find hiding in all the nooks and crannies within a tropical rainforest. The dinosaur ecosystems that we were studying in Dinosaur Provincial Park is roughly equivalent to a temperate rainforest, so their values would fall somewhere in here. And then we run this model and we get a range of values for D here, corresponding to these colors on the graph here. And you can see that at low values of carrying capacity, we're not able to sustain a very dense population of animals on the landscape. And at high values of carrying capacity and cold-blooded animals that don't need to eat very much, we're able to sustain a high density of animals on the landscape. So that's really what I'm saying here. So density with a high metabolic requirement and a low carrying capacity, you get about, according to our model, about half an individual per square kilometer, which equates to, for an area of Dinosaur Provincial Park, which is near Brooks, how far is Brooks from here? 2-hour drive, something like that? In an area of Dinosaur Provincial Park, we might expect something like 4 individuals in the whole area of the park, which seems quite low. And at the other end of the spectrum, assuming low metabolic needs and a high carrying capacity, you might sustain 75 individuals of these mega herbivorous dinosaurs per square kilometer, which equates to about 6,000 animals living in Dinosaur Provincial Park at one time. So for comparison, big African mega herbivores, things like giraffe and elephants and rhinoceros living on the landscape, vary between about 0.1 to 30 individuals per square kilometer. So our bracket goes quite a bit higher than that. And again, we figure these dinosaurs were probably living in something like a modern temperate rainforest, which falls probably somewhere between these two bracketed values. They probably had metabolisms that were somewhere between an endotherm and an ectotherm. So we might expect roughly, very roughly, these values here in Dinosaur Park. Maybe 300 ankylosaurs, the club-tailed dinosaurs in there, 600, so double that for these horned dinosaurs, perhaps as many as 2,000 duck-billed hadrosaurs. So again, just putting some rough values here. And I've been speaking so far about animal density, but another aspect we might think about is the diversity. If you go to Dinosaur Park today and you look through the rock record, you'll find a whole diversity of these big herbivorous dinosaurs. We've got the ankylosaurs here, which I'm circling, a few species of those. We've got various species of horned dinosaurs here, and on the far right we've got these duck-billed dinosaurs. And what's interesting is if you look through any segment in time within that rock record there, you're going to find, living at any one time, usually 2 ankylosaurs, 2 ceratopsids at least, and 2 duck-billed dinosaurs. And I want to say at this point that each of these groups come in 2 different flavors, as it were. So among the ankylosaurs, the armored dinosaurs, usually you get 1 nodosaurid, which are the ankylosaurs without clubs on the ends of their tails, generally speaking. And you get 1 ankylosaurid, which had these big clubs on the end of their tails. Think of Ankylosaurus, for example. You get 1, among the horned dinosaurs, you get 1 centrosaurine. These things had relatively short frills with all kinds of doodads and spikes coming off the back. Big horn on the nose, but generally no horns over the eyes. And you usually get 1 chasmosaurine ceratopsid. Think of Triceratops, a large frill with big horns over top of the eyes. And you get 2 flavors usually of these horned dinosaurs too. You get what's called a lambeosaurine, which had these big crests on their heads, which were hollowed out and may have been used for calling to one another, perhaps. And you get, there's Parasaurolophus is a good example there. And you get these hadrosaurines, which didn't have elaborate head crests. So again, just driving home the point that at any one time you get these different flavors of these different groups of mega herbivorous dinosaurs living together. So this sort of raises an interesting question, and this is some work that I did during my PhD, which was well over 10 years ago now. How does an ecosystem support such high megaherbivore diversity? If we go to Africa today, we might be lucky if we see 3 or 4 megaherbivores on the landscape, but there was almost double that probably during the Cretaceous. So how does a landscape support such high megaherbivore diversity, so many different species? Well, there's 2 ideas. One is that food is not limiting, and the other is that food is limiting. And within those, we have these different sort of sub-hypotheses. So it might be that if food is not limiting, this might be due to the fact that there was elevated primary productivity during the Cretaceous, which is to say there were a lot of plant species, lots of plant biomass on the landscape. So imagine if you're trying to share a pie with a group of friends. If the pie is really, really big, well, you don't really need to share it because there's more than enough to go around, and you can invite more friends and you can eat that big pie. There's lots of food to go around. Or it might be that dinosaur metabolism was quite low, and so they just didn't need to eat a lot. So again, imagine you're with your friends and you want to eat this pie. Well, if nobody's particularly hungry, then there's more than enough pie to go around because nobody wants to eat very much of it. So in that case, food is not limiting. It's these other factors that might be allowing dinosaur diversity to be high. The other option here is that food is limiting. So the pie is of a given size, and these different species have to figure out a way to share it amongst themselves by slicing the pie into smaller pieces so that there's enough to go around. And this is effectively the concept of niche partitioning. So if we look on the African savanna today, we see niche partitioning among its megaherbivores. We've got things like giraffe feeding high up in the acacia trees here, zebras and wildebeest feeding low to the ground. And generally they're feeding on different things, and they're able to sort of divvy up the pie, as it were, in this way. So niche partitioning is just really, think of it as being specializing on eating particular foodstuffs within the environment to avoid competing with your neighbors. And this specialization for different food types is reflected in the morphology or the anatomy of the animal. And this is a term, a sort of a specialized term we use to make ourselves sound smart, called ecomorphology. And there's 2 parts of the word here. Eco referring to ecology, the ecology of the animal, and morphology refers to the anatomy or the shape of the animal. So how the ecology of the animal influences the shape is the idea I'm trying to get across here. And if we study living hooved mammals, we can see that animals that eat, that specialize on different foodstuffs vary in the shapes of their skulls and in the attachment sites of certain muscles. For example, the breadth of the skull or the depth of the skull. Animals that eat particularly hard plant parts tend to have quite deep skulls. Don Henderson here has done some work on that in these horned dinosaurs. We might look at their teeth, and we see that animals that eat a lot of grass have these high crown teeth, these hypsodont teeth, things like zebra or horses might be a good example of that. Whereas animals that feed higher up in the trees that aren't eating as much grass have these much lower crown teeth. Grazing and browsing animals today differ from one another in the width of the snout. So animals that are feeding very low to the ground, grazing on grass, tend to have very broad snouts because they want to ingest a lot of grass because it's not especially nutritious, so you got to take a lot in. And if you want to do that efficiently, you want to have a broad snout. Whereas animals that are eating high up in the trees, think of like a giraffe, have these narrow snouts because they want to feed selectively on the most nutritious parts of the tree. And these different browsing and grazing groups differ in the shape of the stomach too. So it's not just in the skeletal anatomy, but it's in the soft tissue anatomy as well, which unfortunately we don't have a great record of in the fossil record. Certainly we haven't found too many fossilized stomachs yet. So here's the argument I'm going to present to you today. I usually hate putting text on my slides, but I really couldn't get away with this, so I'm going to refer back to this and I'll walk you through it first. And I'll just, I've laid the argument out in what we call a syllogism, so it's a series of premises that are followed by a conclusion, and we're going to test some of these premises here, and others we're going to just assume are true, okay? So first of all, premise one, if plant food in Dinosaur Provincial Park, 75 million years ago, limited megaherbivore diversity, then the number of ecologically equivalent species, which is to say species that fed on the same foods, which we determined from ecomorphology, which we just spoke about, the number of ecologically equivalent species should have been minimized, which would have reduced competition and facilitated dietary niche partitioning among coexisting species. That's a lot to take in, but the idea, again, is if two animals are living together and they require the same resources, they can't live together forever if food is limiting because they'd be competing with one another otherwise. So where ecologically equivalent megaherbivores did coexist, their coexistence should have been short-lived because of competition, or implicated only rare taxa due to competition, okay? So the two premises I'm going to test here are the next two. First of all, premise 3, ecomorphological overlap was limited, and premise 4, ecologically equivalent megaherbivores were incapable of prolonged coexistence. So I'm going to test these two premises here. These other two I'm going to assume are correct because we inherit that knowledge from the ecologists. And I'm not an ecologist, so I'll take their word for it. So if all these premises are true, then this conclusion follows. Plant food was limiting and competition regulated megaherbivore diversity in Dinosaur Provincial Park 75 million years ago when they were still alive. All right, so I'm going to look at the first, or rather the third premise here by looking at the ecomorphology of these animals. So this is work that I did, again, during my PhD, and I published some papers looking at different aspects of the ecomorphology of these dinosaurs. And the first thing I looked at was trying to reconstruct their feeding heights. And how did I do that? It's not necessarily an easy thing to know unless you've got complete skeletons, but Dinosaur Park's great because we have lots of skeletons that we can study. And in looking at a lot of the four-legged animals, the quadrupedal animals, it turns out that their mouth, the presumed level at which they would have been feeding, is about equivalent to their shoulder height. And we can calculate the shoulder height if we add up the lengths of the bones in the limbs, so the metacarpals and the radius in the forearm and the humerus in the upper arm. And this holds for the horned dinosaurs, the ankylosaurs, and very roughly speaking, we calculated hip height for these duck-billed dinosaurs, which roughly approximates mouth height here. But of course, the duck-billed dinosaurs were we think they were capable of rearing up on their hind legs to feed up in the treetops. And so we can do some trigonometry here. If we know the hip height and the tail lengths of these things, we can calculate about how high they could reach up into the sky, as it were. And by doing that, we can calculate these rough feeding heights for these different groups. And we see that really feeding height doesn't do an excellent job of discriminating these animals. Here's your ankylosaurs and horned dinosaurs that feed at roughly equivalent heights. And your hadrosaurs, unsurprisingly, are feeding a little higher. And if they rear up on their hind legs, they can feed up as high as maybe 5 meters above the ground. So feeding height is able to discriminate some, but not all of these groups, that is to say. I referenced the fact earlier that we can discriminate browsing and grazing hoofed mammals today from the different shapes of their skulls, which we know correspond to these different aspects of feeding, and we can sort of retrodict some of those principles onto the skulls of these different dinosaur groups to see how well we can separate them according to all these different linear measurements that we take from the skulls. And as it turns out, some of these measurements are pretty useful in discriminating the different groups too. So we've got ankylosaurs in red up here, and hadrosaurs in blue, these duck-billed dinosaurs, and here's your horned dinosaurs in yellow. And within those groups, we're able to discriminate the different flavors, the different varieties of animals that I mentioned earlier too. The nodosaurids from the ankylosaurids, We're able to separate the chasmosaurians and the centrosaurians a little less well here. We're able to discriminate the centrosaurian and the chasmosaurians here, and the hadrosaurians and the lambeosaurians here. We can discriminate them pretty well too, with all these different metrics here. So again, referring to the ecomorphometrics of the skull morphometrics, we can tease apart those groups relatively well. How about muzzle shape? I referred to the shape of the snout earlier between browsers and grazers. Here's a grazing rhinoceros feeding low to the ground. You can see it's got a very broad snout. Here's that browsing giraffe I referenced earlier. It's got a very narrow snout for feeding selectively in the acacia trees. And we see variety in snout shape in these big mega herbivores too. Here's a broad-billed duck-billed dinosaur here, and a very narrow-beaked horned dinosaur. And if we look at beak shape, we can see that it does a reasonably good job of separating some of these groups here too. The horned dinosaurs are over here, well separated from the more broad-beaked duck-billed dinosaurs and ankylosaurs. I looked at jaw mechanics. This was a sort of a fun task to take on. We know that we're able to estimate the line of action of the muscles that open and shut the jaws in these animals based on the muscle scars that are left on the bones. And so we can get some idea about the muscles that attached on the jaws of these animals, and then we can reconstruct the pulls of these muscles and develop this sort of lever system and calculate the force, assuming a given force that goes into the system, which is exerted by the muscles on the jaw. You can get some idea for the relative output at different bite points along the jaw here. And we were able to show that, these horned dinosaurs and duck-billed hadrosaurids, especially moving towards the back of the jaw, they get these relatively quite high bite points. In fact, for every unit of input force exerted by the muscles, you get a higher output force at the bite point because they have these very spectacular jaws that I'm not going to go into in any great length here. But again, we can use these lever mechanics to separate some of these groups as well. Lastly, I think I looked at tooth wear. So if we look at the teeth of browsing and grazing animals today, we can see that they differ in the variety of pits and scratches that are left on their teeth while they're feeding. So you can imagine if an animal's feeding low to the ground, it's ingesting a lot of grit maybe. There are what are called silica phytoliths that are within the grass, which are these small little particles of sand really. And these serve to leave scratches on the teeth. Animals that are feeding high up in the trees tend to specialize on things like fruits and whatnot. The fruits contain seeds, and those seeds will often leave pits on the teeth. And so we're able to discriminate browsing and grazing animals based on the what we call the tooth microwear, if we look at the teeth under the microscope. And you can do this for dinosaurs too. This is the tooth of a horned dinosaur. We put that under the microscope, and you can see here that it's got all these lineations on the teeth, some pits, but more scratches. And we count those up and average them across groups, and we're able to discriminate. You don't need to look at all these graphs, but we're able to discriminate some of these groups using microwear too. And duckbills show a big swath of microwear variation, whereas the horned dinosaurs here regularly have many more scratches than pits, so they probably didn't eat a very diverse range of food. So in the preceding examples, I kind of just wanted to make the point that although no one sort of measurement that we might consider, no one is able to separate all the groups, what we really want to do is consider all these different lines of evidence together in what we call one big sort of meta-analysis. And if we do that, if we consider all these together, we're actually able to pull out these groups pretty well. So we can discriminate these two types of armored dinosaurs, nodosaurids and ankylosaurids. We're able to discriminate the chasmosaurian and centrosaurian horned dinosaurs pretty well. And we can pretty well separate, there's some overlap of course, but we're able to separate the crested lambeosaurines from the crestless hadrosaurines in yellow here. So all these different aspects that we look at in toto, sort of en masse, we're able to separate these groups. So I would argue that ecomorphological overlap between these groups was limited, which is to say there isn't a whole lot. There's some overlap, but not a whole lot of overlap between these groups. So they occupy different areas of what we might call an ecomorphospace, which is what I showed you in the last slide. So how about premise 4 here? Ecologically equivalent megaherbivores were incapable of prolonged coexistence. Again, the idea is due to competition. If they were competing with one another, Gauss's competitive exclusion principle in ecology tells us that no two animals in competition with one another can coexist indefinitely. Eventually, one's got to go extinct or get driven out of the system somehow. Maybe it moves away or whatever, but they can't compete indefinitely. Well, what's interesting is if we break up this ecomorphospace, if I can call it that, into these two time bins. Here's low in the Dinosaur Park formation, the package of rocks where we find these animals, and here's higher in the formation. What we see is that the animals occupy, generally speaking, the same area of this morphospace. So the roles are the same, but the players are different. If we refer back to our map here of how these different species sort of plot out in the geological record, we can see that the species that we find down here are different from the species that we find up here. And when we do find two equivalent species, which is to say they probably ate the same things, usually one is quite rare, like Parasaurolophus here is a pretty rare animal, or they're very short-lived. We only have very few examples of some of these species. They don't span very far on the record, so they probably weren't around for long competing with the other member of its tribe or what have you. So I would argue that both premise 3 and premise 4 of this argument is true. And that, therefore, that conclusion follows that the diversity of these megaherbivores was regulated by the availability of food for them. So that's all sort of kind of high-level stuff. And what I really wanted to know in my PhD, and I sort of naively thought I'd be able to answer this question. By the end of it, I'm not so sure anymore. But what I really want to know is what were these animals actually eating in their environments? And this is quite hard to get at with the fossil record. But at least very broadly speaking, I tend to think of these ankylosaurs, these armored dinosaurs. They were probably fern specialists. You know, they've got these big, broad muzzles. We know they're restricted to feeding low to the ground. They were bulk feeders, so whatever it was that they were eating, it had to be widely available, just like grass is today, only there was no grass during the Cretaceous period in spite of what you see in some of these pictures here. I just thought they looked pretty. But I think of these ankylosaurs as specializing mainly on ferns, and they were probably taking in some other low-growing plants as well. And Caleb Brown here published on Borealia pelta a few years ago. You can see Borealia pelta out in the gallery. It's got stomach contents, and I'm not very often right in my work, but I was right in this instance because Caleb and his colleagues were able to show that the gut contents contained, by and large, like 90% ferns or something like that. So I felt somewhat vindicated, so thanks, Caleb. These horned dinosaurs, these are weird animals. There's nothing quite like them alive today. We're talking about big-bodied animals. Big-bodied animals generally like to, they've got a big body and they need to fuel it. And if you want to fuel a big body, you need to eat a lot. And if you want to eat a lot, you can't be too selective in what you eat because there might not be enough for you to take in. Except, as I mentioned earlier, these horned dinosaurs have these very selective narrow beaks. So they're a bit of an enigma in that way. And they have this specialized cropping mechanism in the jaws that I mentioned earlier too. I suspect they were probably feeding selectively on tough plants of some kind, be it reeds. We find them very commonly preserved with reeds, as are a lot of these animals. Maybe cycads and horsetails and probably low-growing shrubbery. If I had to sort of reach out to a modern ecological analog, I might say something like a black rhinoceros, which it doesn't have it's got a fairly selective, narrow, doesn't have a beak, but muzzle with these lips, that kind of pinch off low-growing woody brows. So I think of them as something akin to these horned dinosaurs. But again, it's hard to find a good analog in modern ecosystems. These duck-billed dinosaurs, I think, were just eating whatever they wanted to. They weren't especially selective. They were able to feed high or low to the ground. They had big bodies. They had very strong jaws. I think they just ate whatever they wanted to. And if maybe a horned dinosaur or an ankylosaur moved into the environment, they'd rear up and feed up on the trees, so they weren't having to, share the food with these other animals. So broadly speaking, that's kind of what I picture going on here. And this was a nice piece that I commissioned from a friend of mine, Julius Chitney, amazing paleo artist, and he helped me to reconstruct this environment of this ancient Cretaceous landscape in Dinosaur Park, showing all these different animals feeding in different ways within their environment. But that's only half the story, because we've got, at the same time, all of these little dinosaurs running around too. We've got these dome-headed pachycephalosaurs. We've got these small leptoceratopsian dinosaurs. We've got these thescalosaurine or thescalosaurid dinosaurs. We've also got babies. We've got the babies of the bighorn dinosaurs. We've got babies of the duck-billed dinosaurs, and of course there were baby ankylosaurs too. What were these guys doing in their environments? I had a master's student, Thea Weinberg-Hensler, look at this with me. This was a little trickier because the sample sizes aren't quite as big as what you get in Dinosaur Park, but from what we could tell, we could see that a lot of these groups, using many of the same metrics, are well separated in this ecomorphous space. Here's your Thescalosaurus separated from your Pachycephalosaurus. We see a lot more overlap here, though, between the baby ceratopsian dinosaurs and the baby hadrosaurs and the leptoceratopsians. Probably, I think what's going on is these are small animals, and they were more susceptible to being preyed upon by big tyrannosaurs and whatnot. So their diversity was probably more limited by predation. They were being taken out on the landscape, and they weren't limited by the amount of food available so much as the animals that were feeding on them. And then we did some work down here just showing that among the small-bodied animals, the babies and the other small species, the hadrosaurs especially here, the baby hadrosaurs were the ones that were exerting the most influence at these small body sizes, the most influence on the available resource base. They were quite abundant, we think, on the landscape relative to these other small-bodied animals. As far as work that's still ongoing, I've got this student here. This is Josh Wasserlauf. He's working on a master's degree with me right now, in conjunction with Tom Cullen here, one of my collaborators, and Francois Terrien at the Tyrrell Museum has been helping us with this work too. Josh is looking at the stable isotopes in the teeth of duck-billed dinosaurs, and those isotopes can often reflect the diets of these animals and where they're feeding on the landscape and the sources of water that they're drinking from. And his work, these are very preliminary results so far, but his work is showing so far that we're able to discriminate the adults from the baby hadrosaurs using different isotopes, and we're also able to discriminate in some cases the lambeosaurians from the hadrosaurians as well. So we think probably there's we can look at these additional lines of evidence and sort of plug them in with the other lines of evidence to reinforce the argument that I presented earlier. So this work is forthcoming. So just to sum up, we think the big herbivorous dinosaurs, these mega herbivores, were probably super abundant on the landscape. And when I use that word super abundant, I'm referring to certainly modern ecosystems. Modern ecosystems have been devastated due to climate change and habitat destruction and human hunting and whatnot, but maybe the best point of comparison that we have today might be the Serengeti in Africa, where we do see numerous mega herbivores, but they're still nowhere near as abundant on the landscape as we think that the mega herbivores of Dinosaur Park were. And we think that, or I think anyways, that mega herbivore diversity was limited by the availability of food. So if you think of the classic trophic pyramid, where you've got the plants on the bottom, and then you have the herbivores on top of that, and then you get your predators and apex predators at the very top of that food pyramid. We think that they were limited from the bottom up by the availability of plant resources at the bottom of that food pyramid. Whereas the smaller herbivores were probably, there's some evidence for niche partitioning, but they were probably limited by predation. So that's a top-down, what we call a top-down influence. Again, thinking back to that food pyramid. And many and maybe most dinosaurs don't have very good present-day ecological analogs. I drove that point home with respect to these horned dinosaurs here. And I think that's really what makes them so interesting. If they were easy to interpret, if they all acted and behaved and fed like animals alive today, probably they wouldn't be quite as interesting as we think they are. They're a little alien to us in that way. So as for work that's still to come, I've got a couple of students here, Elizabeth and Ergon, who are working with me looking at the head-neck junction in these ceratopsian or horned dinosaurs. We're seeing some interesting variations there in how these animals sort of oriented their heads on their necks, how they carried their heads. This might have implications for how they were feeding, maybe not. We're sort of investigating that, but there are some interesting differences there we're talking about some other time. My student Kalen here has just started his PhD with me, and he's modeling the relative abundance of dinosaurs on the landscape within North America, and he's probably going to be doing some isotopic work with me too. Again, trying to get some idea about how these animals are spread about on the landscape. And then I'm working with a colleague of mine, Jorge. He's at the University of León in Spain, and he's working on integrating the question of how well integrated were these mega herbivore communities, both in the late Cretaceous, and I think he's working in the Jurassic too, so I'm contributing some work to that he's working on there. So stay tuned for that in the coming years. And I'll finish there, and I'll say thanks to Caleb for hosting me, and thanks to you guys for listening, and thanks to the Tyrrell Museum for, a lot of the fossils here have fed into all the work that you're seeing here for the last decade plus of my life, so I appreciate it very much. Thanks.